The wind howled through the small town, its icy fingers slipping through cracks in the window. Emily sat near the frosted pane, her breath fogging up the glass as she watched the world outside. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, covering everything in a thick white blanket. To most people, it was just another winter afternoon, but to Emily, it felt different. There was something about this cold that gnawed at her, making her feel uneasy. Max, her golden retriever, was tied to the old oak tree in their yard, the rope wrapped tightly around its trunk. The poor dog had always loved being outside, running through the yard and chasing after sticks, but today he looked different. His usual excitement had turned to a quiet stillness. His fur, once a shining golden color, now appeared matted and weighed down by the snow. Emily could see his breath puffing out in little clouds, but the air was so cold, she knew it wasn't long before the cold would seep into his bones. "Daddy, why is Max out there?" Emily asked, her small voice trembling with worry. She had asked this question earlier, when her father had gone outside to tie him up, but he hadn't answered her in the way she had hoped. "He's fine," her father had responded with a shrug, brushing snow off his coat. "Just let him get some fresh air. It's not that cold." But Emily didn't believe him. She could see the cold in Max's eyes as he looked toward the door, waiting for someone to let him inside. He wagged his tail weakly, but it wasn't the usual excited wag she was used to. This one was slow, almost as if he was asking for help. Her heart ached as she continued to watch him. She didn't understand why her father didn't see what she saw. Max wasn't fine. The dog was freezing, and every minute that passed, Emily felt the weight of her helplessness grow heavier. She glanced around the room, hoping for some way to make the situation better. But there was no answer, no easy solution. It was just her, the cold, and the dog in the yard. The snow continued to fall, heavier now, as if nature itself was pressing in on the small house, pushing Emily toward a decision she could no longer avoid. "Please, Max," she whispered to herself, watching him tug gently at the rope. "I won't let you suffer." Without thinking, Emily pushed away from the window and stood up. She had never been one to just sit back and do nothing when someone she loved was in pain. And right now, Max was in pain. He needed her. Grabbing her thick coat from the chair, Emily made up her mind. The cold outside could be unbearable, but she couldn't just leave Max there to freeze. With one last look at her father, who was busy in the other room, she opened the door, the chill of the winter air rushing in as if inviting her to step out and take charge. Max's whine was faint, but it was enough. Emily took a deep breath. She was about to do something she had never done before, take matters into her own hands. The wind howled through the small town, its icy fingers slipping through cracks in the window. Emily sat near the frosted pane, her breath fogging up the glass as she watched the world outside. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, covering everything in a thick white blanket. To most people, it was just another winter afternoon, but to Emily, it felt different. There was something about this cold that gnawed at her, making her feel uneasy. Max, her golden retriever, was tied to the old oak tree in their yard, the rope wrapped tightly around its trunk. The poor dog had always loved being outside, running through the yard and chasing after sticks. But today, he looked different. His usual excitement had turned to a quiet stillness. His fur, once a shining golden color, now appeared matted and weighed down by the snow. Emily could see his breath puffing out in little clouds, but the air was so cold, she knew it wasn't long before the cold would seep into his bones. "Daddy, why is Max out there?" Emily asked, her small voice trembling with worry. She had asked this question earlier, when her father had gone outside to tie him up, but he hadn't answered her in the way she had hoped. "He's fine," her father had responded with a shrug, brushing snow off his coat. "Just let him get some fresh air. It's not that cold." But Emily didn't believe him. She could see the cold in Max's eyes as he looked toward the door, waiting for someone to let him inside. He wagged his tail weakly, but it wasn't the usual excited wag she was used to. This one was slow, almost as if he was asking for help. Her heart ached as she continued to watch him. She didn't understand why her father didn't see what she saw. Max wasn't fine. The dog was freezing, and every minute that passed, Emily felt the weight of her helplessness grow heavier. She glanced around the room, hoping for some way to make the situation better. But there was no answer, no easy solution. It was just her, the cold, and the dog in the yard. The snow continued to fall, heavier now, as if nature itself was pressing in on the small house, pushing Emily toward a decision she could no longer avoid. "Please, Max," she whispered to herself, watching him tug gently at the rope. "I won't let you suffer." Without thinking, Emily pushed away from the window and stood up. She had never been one to just sit back and do nothing when someone she loved was in pain. And right now, Max was in pain. He needed her. Grabbing her thick coat from the chair, Emily made up her mind. The cold outside could be unbearable, but she couldn't just leave Max there to freeze. With one last look at her father, who was busy in the other room, she opened the door, the chill of the winter air rushing in as if inviting her to step out and take charge. Max's whine was faint, but it was enough. Emily took a deep breath. She was about to do something she had never done before, take matters into her own hands. Emily stepped out into the frigid air, the cold biting at her skin like 1,000 tiny needles. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she walked toward Max, who was still shivering by the oak tree. His fur, once so soft and shiny, was now matted with snowflakes that had clung to him in the damp cold. The wind howled around them, making the world feel even colder, but Max's eyes were the hardest to ignore. They were wide with a quiet kind of desperation, his gaze fixed on Emily as if pleading for her help. Her heart twisted with guilt. She had watched him out there for too long already. The cold air made it hard to breathe, but the suffocating weight in her chest was even worse. She had known, deep down, that Max needed her, but she hadn't done anything. The thought of him out here all alone, struggling to stay warm, filled her with dread. "Don't worry, Max," Emily whispered, trying to make her voice steady, though it trembled slightly from the cold. She knelt down in front of him, brushing the snow from his fur. The warmth of his body against her hands gave her some comfort, but the weight of the situation still pressed heavily on her shoulders. Max let out a soft whine and nudged her hand with his nose, as if trying to tell her that he was scared too. Emily could feel the shiver run through his body, and it made her stomach churn. She had to do something. But what? She knew her father was inside the house, and though she tried to explain her worry, he hadn't seemed to understand. He thought Max was tough enough to handle the cold. But Emily knew better. She stood up, her eyes scanning the yard for an idea, anything that could help. The house was too far for her to carry Max back to in this weather, and she couldn't leave him here. There had to be something she could do. Her mind raced as she tried to think of a solution. And then it hit her. The shed. The old storage shed at the edge of their yard. It wasn't much, just a small forgotten space filled with gardening tools and broken lawnmowers, but it could provide shelter. She turned to Max, her decision clear. "Come on, Max. We're going to the shed," she said, her voice firmer now. Max seemed to understand, his tail wagging weakly as he followed her, step by step. The snow was deep, but Emily pushed forward, one step at a time, helping Max along as they moved through the white landscape. Her hands were numb, her breath coming out in sharp bursts, but she couldn't stop now. Not when Max needed her. Each step was a battle against the snow, which now seemed to rise up higher with every stride. The wind howled, biting at Emily's cheeks and making her eyes water, but she refused to stop. Max was right beside her, his breathing shallow and quick, but he was following, trusting her. Emily's heart swelled with determination as she glanced over at him. "You're not alone, Max," she whispered through the wind, trying to offer him some comfort. But even her own voice felt small and fragile against the power of the storm. Still, She couldn't shake the growing anxiety in her chest. The shed was only a few yards away, but it felt like miles. Every step seemed to take longer, the snow drenching her boots and the cold biting deeper into her bones. Max stopped for a moment, his body shivering from the cold, his fur heavy with snow. Emily stopped too, crouching beside him. She could see his breath coming out in soft clouds, his eyes fixed on her as if pleading for more strength. The worry that had been gnawing at her since she first saw him tied to the tree surged again. She took a deep breath, wiping the wet strands of hair from her face. She had to stay calm. She couldn't let Max down now. The shed was still a little way off, but she knew it was the only chance they had. The snow clung to her like a thick, freezing blanket, but she could see it now, the faint outline of the shed against the white landscape. It felt like a beacon of hope, even though it was far from perfect. The shed wasn't much, but it would keep Max out of the snow. It would keep him safe, at least for now. "Almost there, buddy," Emily said, her voice shaky but filled with determination. Max gave a low whine, but he followed her steps again, slowly but surely. She kept her pace steady, urging him forward with every step. When they finally reached the shed, Emily pushed the door open with all her might. The hinges creaked loudly, and the cold air rushed inside. But the shelter was a relief. The wooden walls, though worn and weathered, offered a small sense of protection from the storm. Emily quickly hurried inside, guiding Max with her. The shed smelled of dust and old wood, but it felt warmer than the outside air. Emily looked around, her heart pounding, as she searched for anything she could use. A few old blankets were piled up in the corner, along with some gardening tools. She grabbed one of the blankets, shaking off the snow, and laid it down on the floor as best as she could. Max plopped down gratefully, his head resting on the soft fabric, his eyes half-lidded in exhaustion. Emily crouched down beside him, gently rubbing his fur to warm him up. The cold had already sunk deep into his bones, but with each passing second, she hoped the warmth from the shed would help. She whispered to him, "You're safe now, Max. I won't let anything happen to you." But as she looked around at the bare shed, a feeling of unease lingered in her heart. She knew this wasn't enough, not by a long shot. But for now, it was all she could do. She huddled close to Max, wrapping herself in another blanket she found, trying to keep both of them warm as the wind continued to howl outside. The wind outside howled like a pack of wolves, rattling the shed's worn walls. Inside, the small space felt like a fragile bubble of warmth against the harsh storm. Emily huddled beside Max, her body pressed close to his as she rubbed his back, hoping to get his blood flowing again. His fur was still cold, but he seemed to settle a little more with each passing minute. Emily's breath was still visible in the air, and her cheeks were red from the cold, but she couldn't afford to let her guard down. Max's tail, which had been limp and weak earlier, now gave a small, tentative thump against the floor. Emily smiled weakly. He was going to be okay, at least for now. Her fingers were stiff and her legs ached from the cold, but she didn't dare move away from Max. She couldn't, not until she was certain he was warm enough and safe from the storm outside. She wrapped another blanket around herself, feeling the chill of the air beneath her coat, but it was a small comfort. The reality was that she was still just a little girl, trying to care for a dog who should have never been left out in the snow in the first place. The silence of the shed felt heavy, like it was pressing in on her, but it was a silence that allowed Emily to think. Her mind raced, filled with thoughts of her father and what he might be doing now. Was he looking for her? Was he angry that she had gone outside without his permission? She knew he wouldn't understand. He never did when it came to Max. To him, the dog was just a pet, nothing more. Emily knew better, though. Max wasn't just a dog to her. He was family. He had been there for her through the hardest days, when she was lonely or scared, and she couldn't bear the thought of him suffering because her father didn't understand. The thought of going back inside crossed her mind briefly, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized there was no way she could go back without making sure Max was okay. She couldn't leave him alone in the cold again. Emily stood up, carefully stretching her sore legs. She needed to think of a plan. She couldn't leave him in the shed forever. Maybe she could find a way to get her father to understand. Maybe she could show him how much Max meant to her, and to him. Maybe then, things would be different. But for now, all Emily could do was stay beside him, keep him warm, and pray the storm would pass soon. She lay down next to Max, pressing her cheek against his fur, and closed her eyes, letting the silence of the shed surround them. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. The storm raged on outside, but in the small shed, Emily and Max found a kind of peace. The cold was still present, biting at their skin, but the walls of the shed offered some relief from the worst of the wind. Emily had arranged a small corner with blankets, trying her best to make Max comfortable. He had curled up, his head resting on her lap as she stroked his fur softly. She could feel his body slowly warming up, the tremors from the cold starting to subside. But even as she sat there with Max, the unease in her chest didn't go away. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was only a temporary solution. The shed, though a safe place for now, wasn't a proper home for Max. She couldn't keep him here forever, not when he deserved so much more. The thought of her father lingered in her mind, a constant reminder of the struggle ahead. She knew he would be angry when he found out what she had done. Emily could almost hear his voice now, telling her it wasn't a big deal, that she was overreacting. But Emily wasn't overreacting. She knew that leaving Max out there, alone in the cold, was wrong. Her fingers brushed through Max's fur, and a small sigh escaped her lips. "I wish I could do more for you," she whispered softly to him. He gave her a tired, appreciative look, his eyes half closed as he rested on her lap. Emily smiled, though it was a sad smile. She had always been the one to take care of others, whether it was her mother when she was sick, or her father when he was tired from working all day. But now, in this moment, it was Max who needed her, and she would do anything to make sure he was safe. The minutes passed, the storm outside showing no signs of letting up. Emily tried to think of a way to make things better for Max. She knew she couldn't keep him in the shed forever. Maybe she could convince her father to bring him inside, to let Max be part of their family in a way he never had been before. But that was a thought for later. Right now, all she could do was keep him warm and safe. Just then, she heard a faint noise outside the shed, a crunching sound in the snow, followed by footsteps. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Was it her father? Had he come looking for her? She stood up quickly, her mind racing. She couldn't let him find out what she had done. She couldn't let him be angry at her for taking Max to the shed. She glanced down at Max, still curled up in the blankets, and made a quick decision. She grabbed the door handle, gently pushing it open just a crack, peering outside. Through the falling snow, she saw a figure moving toward the shed. Her heart pounded. Who could it be? The figure outside moved closer, and Emily's heart raced in her chest. She barely dared to breathe, her eyes fixed on the person approaching the shed. The snow fell heavily, obscuring everything in a soft white haze, but Emily could just make out the outline of a man, trudging through the snow. It was Mrs. Donnelly. Emily let out a quiet sigh of relief, her hand still gripping the door handle as she watched the older woman approach. Mrs. Donnelly was one of their neighbors, and though Emily didn't expect her to be angry, she still felt nervous. After all, she had taken Max out to the shed without telling anyone, and that wasn't something she was sure the grown-ups would approve of. Mrs. Donnelly arrived at the shed door and knocked lightly, her voice muffled by the storm. "Emily, are you in there?" Emily opened the door slowly, just enough to peek her face out into the snow. Mrs. Donnelly's warm eyes immediately softened when she saw Emily standing there, the worry in her gaze quickly replaced by concern for Max, who was now curled up inside the shed. "Well, I see you found a safe place for him," Mrs. Donnelly said, her voice gentle. "Max was looking a bit lost when I saw him out there alone." Emily nodded, her throat tightening. He was cold. I didn't know what else to do. Mrs. Donnelly smiled kindly, her eyes twinkling despite the storm. You did the right thing, Emily. I'm proud of you for taking care of him. Emily felt a little lighter at her words, but she couldn't help the feeling of guilt that still clung to her. But, my dad, he's not going to like this, she said, glancing nervously back at Max, who was now starting to look more comfortable in the warmth of the blankets. Mrs. Donnelly knelt down to Emily's level and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Don't you worry about that right now. What's important is that Max is safe, and I think, deep down, your father will understand. Just then, Emily's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her fingers cold and stiff, and saw a message from her father. Where are you? I've been looking for you. Her stomach twisted. Her father was searching for her, no doubt worried. But Emily knew that once he saw Max, once he realized how badly he'd been neglected, things might change. Before she could respond, Mrs. Donnelly spoke up again. You don't have to go through this alone, Emily. You've already shown a lot of courage. Let me help. She paused, her expression thoughtful. I'll let the other neighbors know what you've done. They'll want to help too. Emily looked up at her with surprise. You mean they'll help me? With Max? Of course, Mrs. Donnelly said, her smile warm. You've done something kind, something that's worth supporting. You'll see. People around here care more than you think. The relief that washed over Emily was overwhelming. Mrs. Donnelly's kindness made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in all of this. Thank you, Emily whispered, her voice trembling with gratitude. Mrs. Donnelly nodded. You've got a big heart, Emily. Don't ever forget that. The snow continued to fall, but the storm outside seemed to lose its fury, as if it too understood that something important was happening in that small shed. Emily stood at the door, Mrs. Donnelly by her side, both watching as Max lay quietly, nestled in his blankets. The warmth in the shed contrasted sharply with the biting cold outside, and for the first time that afternoon, Emily allowed herself to relax, if only just a little. But her father's message still hung heavily in her mind. He was looking for her. And though Mrs. Donnelly had reassured her that she was doing the right thing, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of impending confrontation. She had broken the rules. She had taken Max out to the shed without asking, without permission. And that, in her father's world, was something that could never be overlooked. Should I answer him? Emily asked quietly, glancing at Mrs. Donnelly. She held the phone in her hand, hesitating. Mrs. Donnelly placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder again. You don't have to rush, Emily, but you should let him know where you are. Tell him Max is okay. Maybe this is the chance to show him what a good dog he really is. The words sank deep into Emily's heart. Her father had always thought of Max as just a pet, an animal to be fed, watered, and kept outside. But to Emily, Max was so much more than that. He was her companion, her protector, the one who had been with her on the hardest days. The thought of him being treated as just a dog hurt more than she was willing to admit. Taking a deep breath, Emily unlocked her phone and typed a message. I'm at the shed with Max. He was cold and needed help. I couldn't leave him out there alone. She hit send, her finger trembling as the message sent into the unknown. She wasn't sure what her father would say. Would he be angry? Would he finally understand what she had been trying to explain to him for so long? Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The wind outside howled again, but inside the shed, it was peaceful. Max's breathing had steadied, and his eyes slowly closed as he drifted into a light sleep. Emily glanced up at Mrs. Donnelly, who gave her an encouraging smile. You're doing great, Emily, Mrs. Donnelly said softly. Sometimes the hardest part is just taking the first step. And you've done that. Emily nodded, feeling a sense of pride that she hadn't expected. She hadn't given up on Max, even when things seemed impossible. And now she was starting to believe that her father might finally see just how much Max meant to her. Just as she was about to say something to Mrs. Donnelly, her phone buzzed again. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she quickly opened the message. It was from her father. Emily's fingers shook slightly as she opened the message from her father. Her heart pounded in her chest as she read it. "I'm sorry, Emily. I didn't realize. I'll be home soon. We'll take care of Max together." For a moment, she just stared at the words, letting them sink in. Her father, the man who had always treated Max as nothing more than a pet, was admitting something she never thought she would hear. He didn't realize. Emily felt a surge of emotion flood through her, relief, hope, and something else she couldn't quite name. She looked up at Mrs. Donnelly, whose smile grew wider as she saw Emily's reaction. "You did it, Emily," Mrs. Donnelly said softly. "You showed him the truth. Sometimes, all it takes is someone to care enough to stand up for what's right." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, though she quickly blinked them away. She didn't want to cry in front of Mrs. Donnelly, but she couldn't help it. The weight of everything, her love for Max, the struggle to be heard, the fear that she wouldn't be able to protect him, had finally lifted. He really means it," Emily whispered, still in shock. Mrs. Donnelly nodded. "I think he does, dear. And it's a good thing. Max is lucky to have someone like you who'll fight for him. You've shown him what family truly means." Emily's chest felt lighter, but the journey wasn't over yet. There was still a lot to be done. She couldn't just leave things as they were. She had to make sure Max was safe, that her father understood how important it was to treat him with the love he deserved. As she stood there, looking at the sleeping dog beside her, Emily made a promise to herself. She would keep standing up for Max. She would make sure he was never forgotten or left out in the cold again. He was more than just a dog to her. He was her family, and she would fight for him no matter what. Just then, the sound of footsteps crunched through the snow, drawing closer. Emily looked up and saw her father, trudging through the snow with a solemn but gentle look on his face. He paused at the door of the shed, looking in at Max, then meeting Emily's eyes. Without a word, he stepped inside, kneeling down beside Max. For the first time, he seemed to truly notice how fragile and vulnerable the dog was. "Max," he said softly, stroking the dog's fur with a tenderness that surprised Emily. "I'm sorry, boy. I should have taken better care of you." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had never heard her father speak like that. It was as if the entire weight of everything had finally hit him. Her father looked up at her, his eyes softer now. "I didn't know how much he meant to you. I see it now, Emily. We'll take care of him. Together." Tears filled Emily's eyes again, but this time they were tears of pure joy. For the first time, she felt like her father truly understood. And for Max, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where he would no longer be forgotten in the cold, but instead treated as the family member he had always been. Emily smiled through her tears, knowing that she had fought for what was right, and that she had won.